Slow Dance at Dusk, Book 4 in a Sunburned Land series, written by Juliette Duncan, narrated by Sarah Kennedy.
Chapters 11 to 20.
Chapter 11. Talk of the wedding continued at fever pace, and Janella grew more and more concerned. She wanted Joshua and Stella to be happy, but this wasn't the way. No one else seemed to share her feelings, and as the days passed, she was uncertain whether she should speak up or hold her tongue. Indecision wasn't usually something she suffered with. She knew what was right and what was wrong, and had always tried to do the right thing. When things were rocky in the household, she'd remained steady and stable. However, now she was the one who needed a boy to stay afloat. A pile of laundry had grown exponentially. She had little interest in it. Now, sitting and folding her third load for the day, exhaustion filled her bones. Still, her mind was unsettled. One thought filled it even more than her concerns about Joshua's engagement. Would she ever feel normal again? Would she ever feel like herself and not the pale facsimile who acted like Janella? Pulling one of Caleb's shirts from the pile, she checked the collar. It was a size 16. Her shoulders drooped. Her boy was growing into a man and she wasn't ready. Soon he'd fit into his father's shirts. Her gaze drifted to the wardrobe where Julian's clothing remained on hangers and folded in drawers. She hadn't the heart to give them away, despite the assurances of others that it would help ease her into the idea that he was gone. She didn't need to be eased into it. Every day she woke up and his absence screamed at her. Tearing her gaze away, she folded the shirt and set it aside before pulling a new one from the pile. As if to torture her, the item that came to hand was one of Julian's shirts. Looking at the emerald green button-down reminded her of the seafoam accent wall behind their bed. Julian had insisted the room needed some brightening, and being a lover of green, he chose that colour. At first, she didn't like it, but now she loved it. It was part of the fabric of their marriage. She liked her keepsakes, and the walls and surfaces were covered in photos, paintings, and baby handprints set in clay. The way she hadn't complained about the paint, Julian never complained about her sense of decor. Their past was on display around her. There was no escaping it, and she didn't wish to. She wanted to cling to those times as long as she could. She wanted to hold on to Julian a while longer, although one day she'd have to let go. Her stomach twisted in knots as she pulled the shirt to her and inhaled deeply, her eyes closing. Julian's scent permeated the fabric as if it was a part of the weaving. She could see him clearly as she smelled it. She clutched the shirt tighter, willing the scent to permeate her too, to become part of her so that he would never truly be gone. He'd live in her senses, forever. She heard the sobbing before realising it was her crying. The tears she'd tried so diligently to suppress the past few days finally overtook her. Rolling down her cheeks like a broken dam, she wept for the man she loved. Why, Lord? Why did he have to die? She'd asked the question 1,000 times without an answer. Why did the God she loved take her husband from her and her children? You said you'd never leave me or forsake me, Lord. Then why did you do this? Why did you take him away when things were starting to turn around? Julian was finally seeing his way in you. He was praying more and believing more. He was trying. Why did you take him, Lord? Tears rolled faster the more she summoned an answer, and the deeper the silence became until she was oblivious to every other sound, including that of Caleb entering the room. "Mum, what's the matter?" he asked, rushing to her side. He sat beside her on the bed and wrapped his arms around her. "Don't cry, Mum. Please don't cry. I don't know what to do when you cry. Tell me what to do." Janella could hear the sadness in her son's voice as she lowered the shirt from her face and looked at him. He wanted to help her, to make the pain go away. Her baby boy was growing up, maturing before her eyes. It isn't his place to comfort me, Lord. I'm supposed to take care of him. I'm okay, she said, sniffing. No, you're not. You're crying. His protest came with a stern look. Don't say you're something when you're not. Don't lie, Mum. I know you miss Dad. His voice lowered. I miss him too. She looked at her son in wonder. When did he grow up? How was she ever going to say goodbye and let Darwin have him? She heard Julian's voice in her head. It's what's right, Janella. The boy can't stay tied to your apron strings forever. He has to go out and experience the world as I did. He'll learn to appreciate what he has even more afterwards. You have to let him be a man. He can't stay a boy forever. She nodded. You're right, Caleb, I shouldn't lie. I'm sorry, I do miss your father. I miss him so much. Sometimes I don't know what I'm going to do. The honesty felt good, and so did the hug that followed. Caleb wrapped his arms tightly around her and squeezed as if he wanted to force every ounce of pain from her. She hugged him back with equal vigour, and they both chuckled. I'm not going to leave you, Caleb whispered. I'm going to stay right here and help Grandpa and you on the station. I can pull my weight. Releasing him, she met his gaze. The consternation in his expression was enough to prove he was serious. You can't. He frowned. Why not? You need me and Grandpa needs help. She shook her head. That doesn't mean you should stay. We'll manage. We've done it before and we can do it again. Your Grandpa is more than capable of taking charge of the station. Or Uncle Joshua, Caleb added. Janella was silent. Joshua was too busy fussing over his new fiancée. She hadn't heard anything about his plans for the station, if he had any. She tried to stamp down the bitterness she felt. Why was she begrudging him happiness? It wasn't like her. She never revelled in anyone's pain or disregarded any person's joy, but this time, she couldn't muster the substance to be happy for Joshua. She simply couldn't. Either way, she continued, you don't have to stay here. I want to, Caleb said firmly. She looked into her little boy's eyes and spoke tenderly. Your father wouldn't have wanted you to stay here. He would have wanted you to go to school, and that's what you'll do. I don't want to hear another word about it. I know you want to help, but that isn't the way, okay? She tilted her head slightly and smiled. Okay, he answered, sulking. Your father was so excited about you going to Darwin, to the same school he attended. He told everyone about it. Janella lifted her son's chin with her finger. He wouldn't want you to miss out on that. You have to go and make him proud. Caleb's eyes glistened. I know. I always wanted him to be proud of me. He was, Caleb, Janella assured. You were his son. He was always proud of you, even if he didn't show it. He wasn't an easy man to understand sometimes. He tried to do what was right every chance he got, and sometimes he forgot that others didn't see things the same way he did. But he loved us. He loved his entire family and only wanted what was best. Caleb nodded. We were just starting to spend time together. He was going to take me fishing before I went to school. I'll take you. She wasn't any good with a rod, but for her son, she'd try. That's okay, you don't have to. I want to. Caleb's face twisted in amusement. Mum, you can't fish. You only ever catch branches. She laughed. It was true. On their last trip, she caught a twisted branch and a rubber tyre. She could understand why he wasn't enthusiastic about her offer. Very well. I'll ask your grandfather to take you. How does that sound? Caleb's eyes brightened. Do you think he'll have time? I know he's busy with the station and Grandma Maggie. I'm sure she'd love to go fishing too. She may even be better at it than me, Janella chortled. I hope so. She couldn't be worse. Hey, I resent that, Janella laughed as she hugged her son tightly. It took a moment to realise what had happened. She hadn't laughed since Julian's death, but here she was, smiling and chuckling with her son. Count it all joy. The words whispered through her mind like a cloud. She looked at Caleb. Though there was sorrow, joy still lived deep inside. Somewhere. She just had to find a way to tap into it. They both had to. Want to help me fold these? Caleb turned up his lip and then smiled as he grabbed a t-shirt. Sure. The pair sat folding clothes in peaceful silence. The room didn't scream anymore that Julian was gone. It whispered. What was loudest was the voice that told Janella to hold on to this time with Caleb because too soon he'd be gone. And she wouldn't be able to enjoy being part of his life as she did now. He'd be far away, and she wouldn't get to watch him grow. Except when he came home for holidays. She peeked at him as he concentrated on folding a shirt, and a wistful smile grew on her face. Lord bless my little boy as he goes out into the world. Keep him safe from harm and heal his pain. Chapter 12. It was an oddly clear day. The wind was mild and only a few sparse clouds rolled by. At least for today, there might be a reprieve from the customary seasonal torrents. Stella was happy since it would make her work less messy. She was doing hoof checks on some of the cattle. There was a murmur of foot and mouth going around, and she wanted to keep an eye out for any signs that may have come their way. She was hopeful the rumours were just that, and there'd be no outbreak. But it never hurt to be on top of things. Dressed in khaki shorts and shirt, she perched on the steps of her small porch and stared at the dazzling diamond on her finger. She still couldn't believe it. Joshua had proposed, but trepidation tempered the euphoria she felt whenever she thought of their engagement, which was just about always. The family was still grieving, and her and Joshua's announcement might have been too soon. But they were in love and wanted the world to know it. The first hint that their engagement wasn't entirely accepted was the moment Janella saw the ring. Stella tried to tell herself it was all in her head, but she couldn't forget the shock on Janella's face and the convenient headache she seemed to have gotten straight after. Joshua tried to assure her that Janella was happy for them and the headache was just a coincidence, but Stella wasn't sure, and she really didn't want to know. It was one thing to believe something to be true and another to have it confirmed. She was basking in the joy of her new engagement and didn't want to have that disturbed with objections. She didn't want to hear them. Better to pretend they didn't exist. For now, at least. Good morning, Stella. At the sound of Maggie's cheerful voice, her gaze swiveled up. Good morning, Maggie. The older woman sat on the step beside her, a pleasant smile on her face. Admiring your ring? Stella felt her cheeks warm. It's vain, isn't it? Not at all. Maggie chuckled. A woman is allowed to be enchanted by her engagement ring. I was the same when Frank proposed to me. For days I kept looking at it, hardly believing it had happened. Have you told your family yet? Stella sighed. No. Is there a problem? Maggie frowned. Stella shrugged. Not really. We'd like to tell them in person since Joshua hasn't officially met my parents yet, at least not as an adult. And it might help with any concerns they have about how quickly it's happened. But I've only just come back and they live so far away. Well, there's always Skype or Zoom. I know, but it wouldn't be the same, would it? No, it wouldn't. You're right. I'm sure Frank would give you time off to go. Stella wasn't so sure. Both she and Joshua had a lot of work to do. Are you worried your parents will think it's too soon? There was genuine concern in Maggie's voice, and Stella appreciated it, despite the slight bristling she felt at the question. She'd hoped to avoid the topic of timing, but she couldn't ignore it forever. She might as well address it now. She'd probably hear more of the same later, once everyone's euphoria wore off. A little, but I know what I feel and I know this is right. Knowing someone doesn't equate to time spent together. Some people know each other for years and still have secrets. With Joshua, I know there aren't any. We're kindred spirits. It's almost as if I've known him my entire life. Didn't you meet before as youngsters? Yes and no, Stella answered. Goddard Downs always had great gatherings every year, but I wasn't always able to attend. I was sick as a child. I had epilepsy and my seizures were sometimes dreadful. I lived in Kununurra with my grandmother so I could be closer to the hospital. I didn't live at Indigo until I was 13. Maggie studied her thoughtfully. I'm sorry, I didn't know. You're better now, though. Stella smiled. No need to be sorry, and yes, I'm perfectly fine now. I haven't had a seizure since I was a teenager. My grandmother said it was a miraculous healing. Maggie's head tilted. And was it? Stella rarely talked about her past, but there was something about Maggie that made her feel she could share. Yes, it was. She met Maggie's gaze. My grandmother believed that God could heal me. She was an amazing woman of faith. I wish I could have met her. You must miss her a lot. I do. She prayed for me every day, and one day, while she was praying, I felt this soothing warmth, like a hug, flow through me. That was it. A few days passed with no seizures. Then weeks and months. Still no seizures. The doctors were baffled. My EEGs were normal. EEG? Electroencephalogram. It's a scan of the brain to check for unusual activity. Most times it tells you things are fine because you aren't having a seizure at the time, but with me, I would have small seizures, almost imperceptible, going on all the time. Then I'd get big ones. Her voice dipped as she recalled those times. It wasn't easy for her or her grandmother, or her parents who were constantly worried but couldn't be there with her. They were all afraid that every seizure she had would be her last. Such a long word. I think doctors invent words so they can look smarter. Maggie chuckled softly. Stella dragged herself back to the moment and away from the unpleasant memories. I agree. Joshua knows all about your seizures, I take it? Yes, we discussed it. We had to. I didn't want any secrets between us, even if I don't suffer from them anymore. I wanted him to know. Maggie smiled. That's good. I think it's wonderful you're both being so mature and forthcoming about your lives. It will make the adjustments to married life easier. That's what we want, Stella replied, nodding. I'm glad. Frank and I both support you. I wanted to come over and say that personally. We haven't had much time to speak since your engagement was announced. I believe you had some part in the engagement coming off, Stella grinned. Joshua told me you helped him pick out the ring. Maggie chuckled. He picked it himself. I simply gave him a few tips when it came to picking the right one. It was mostly moral support more than anything else. It was also a chance to spend some time with him. There was a hint of something in Maggie's voice. Wistfulness, perhaps? Stella guessed it might have been the first time she'd done something alone with Joshua. She wanted to ask, and usually she would have, but she didn't want to pry. Maggie's voice brightened. I should probably let you get going. I'm sure you have work to do. I was on my way to the house to check on the gardens and the chickens. Isabel and I have a little routine we like to follow. Ah, Stella laughed. Isabel, I like her. She's very precious. Maggie chuckled. You can say that again. She's a little darling who knows her mind quite well. Sounds like me when I was a child, Stella replied. I always had something to say. The doctors and nurses would take time out to chat with me and make me feel better, especially if my grandmother had to be away from the hospital. That must have been difficult for you and for her. It was hard when Serena had her accident and suffered the burns you can see on her now. Although she was an adult when that happened, I didn't like leaving her alone. It must have been so hard for your parents and grandmother. Yes, I think it was. But they couldn't be with me 24/7. They did their best, though. As most parents and grandparents do, Maggie smiled. As a mother, I always tried my best for my children. We don't always get it right, but it helps a lot knowing God's looking after them when we can't or when we get things wrong. The gentle assurance made Stella smile. Had her mother felt the same when she was growing up? Would she feel that way when it was her turn to be a mother? Children. Stella wanted them, but she'd never allowed herself time to dwell too much on the subject, given she hadn't been in a relationship. Now that she was, she'd have to give it some thought. She and Joshua would both need to think about it. And talk about it. Maggie patted her thighs and stood. Well, I should be getting to the house. I don't want to keep Isabel waiting. No, Stella said with a chuckle. I'm sure she'd be upset if you did. Precisely. Have a great day, Stella. I hope we get to talk more. Stella pushed to her feet. I hope so too, Maggie. The hug that followed was awkward at first, neither of them sure if they should do it, but wanting to. Stella felt a need to connect with Joshua's stepmother. Perhaps it was because her mother was so far away, or maybe she simply wanted a hug. Regardless of the reason, she wrapped her arms around Maggie and squeezed. Thank you, she whispered. You're welcome, Maggie replied. The day didn't unfold as Stella hoped. Soon after midday, the clear sky dissolved into an angry swathe of menacing clouds that came from nowhere, and not long after, heavy, driving rain drenched the land. With her cattle inspection thwarted, she sought out Joshua when she returned to the house, but he and Nathan had gone to rescue a herd of cattle that had strayed into a gully and could drown if the rain continued. Most likely they wouldn't make it back in time for dinner. That meant she'd be on her own with the family for the first time since she and Joshua made their announcement. Although they'd been nothing but kind and supportive on the surface, every day she expected questions about the speed of their engagement. But other than Maggie's question earlier that morning, they hadn't come. One day they would, she was sure of it. If she'd questioned it, others were sure to as well. With a free afternoon, she headed back to her rooms and did some long overdue cleaning. The washing would have to wait, though. No use doing it with rain falling like it would never end. After dusting and tidying up, she grabbed a book and lay on her bed intending to read, but within moments, her eyes closed. She'd drifted off when the phone rang, pulling her from this rare afternoon treat. Groaning, she sat and grabbed her phone, but her displeasure was quickly replaced when she saw Elizabeth's name flashing on the screen. Hey Liz, how are you? Wonderful, her cousin replied cheerfully. I thought I'd check in with you. I heard there were some pretty bad storms heading your way and I wanted to be sure you were okay. Stella glanced out the window, although there was no need to. The rain on the tin roof was so loud she wondered how she'd ever drifted off. We're fine, although Joshua and Nathan are out rescuing some cattle. Oh dear, I hope they're safe. Stella winced. Me too. So, how are things progressing with you and Josh? Stella hesitated. She and Joshua had wanted to break the news to both sides of her family in person. But how could she not tell Liz now, especially when she'd asked? Liz wasn't only her cousin, but her best friend, and she was chomping at the bit to share news of her engagement. Surely Joshua wouldn't mind. She bit her lip and let the words slip from her tongue as a grin a mile wide split her face. Good, he proposed. What? Liz's voice rose to a crescendo on the other end of the line. He proposed, Stella repeated, the night I got back. And you said? Yes, I said yes. We're engaged, Liz. I'm so happy for you. Didn't I say you two were meant for each other? When God opened the door to Goddard Downs, I knew Joshua Goddard would be making a reappearance in your life. I just knew it. Stella rolled her eyes and chuckled. Yes, I remember. And you tried telling me it wasn't going to happen, Elizabeth scoffed. Teaches you to doubt me. I keep telling you I know things, but you never believe me. But anyway, have you told your parents yet? Not yet. Joshua and I want to tell them in person, but I've only just come back, so I'm not sure we'll be able to. The word will get out if you delay too long. Yes, I know. I'd hate for them to find out some other way. She made a mental note to discuss the matter with Joshua when he returned. So, when's the wedding going to be? Elizabeth asked. They hadn't decided on a date, but Stella was hoping it would be sooner rather than later. She couldn't wait to marry Josh. A few months, maybe, after the rainy season? That's not a lot of time. We have a lot of planning to do, Elizabeth spoke quickly. We need to decide on dresses, caterers, location, invitations and all that, and I have to plan your hen's night. Stella laughed at her cousin's enthusiasm. What? Her cousin paused briefly. Of course, I'll be your maid of honour. You don't need to ask, she giggled. Who else would you ask? A grin spread across Stella's face. No one. Of course I was planning on asking you. Great. So So, when can we start planning your trousseau? We'll need to go shopping. Do you want to go to Kununurra or Darwin? I think Darwin, since there are more shops. Stella considered it. Darwin might work out well. Maggie's family are from there and they'll be heading back after the holidays. Also, Caleb's starting school and Janella's going to settle him in. We could all go together. Her cousin laughed. You're already fitting in with your new family. Warmth trickled through Stella like sweet honey. Liz was right. She had a new family. And despite her concerns about whether they considered it too soon, she felt she belonged. I suppose I am. Chapter 13. The next day, Frank ambled down the path on his way to the office, dodging puddles of water left over from last night's storm. Fortunately, it hadn't been as severe as expected, and now the sky was a brilliant blue. When he passed the mechanic's shed, he waved at Caleb, who was hard at work on his bike, a first in months. Since Julian's death, he'd spent most of his time around his mother. It was difficult to watch. Despite Frank's best efforts, he knew that the pain Janella and his grandchildren were feeling wouldn't disappear any time soon. He remembered well the hollowness he felt after Esther's death, the perpetual wishing and hoping it was all a nightmare and that he'd wake to find her there again. Janella was going through what he called the walking wounded phase. She was doing everything she was supposed to, everything she was good at, but beneath the facade, she was barely surviving. The vibration in his pocket made him stop. He plucked his phone from his pocket and looked at the screen. Ravi Tamala. Pressing the green button, he headed for the shade of the shed. Hello, Ravi.
Hello, Frank, my friend. How are you? I'm doing well. And yourself? Excellent. I can't complain. Things are looking very promising for me and my family. The new year should hold many opportunities, which is why I'm calling you. I need to know, Frank, will you be able to meet my demand? I don't mean to pressure you, but a lot is riding on this, and if you can't accommodate me, then I'll have to find someone else. You do understand, don't you? It's by no means anything against you, but I must take this opportunity. It's far too lucrative to pass up.
Frank's heart quickened. The topic of increasing the herd to accommodate Ravi's demand had yet to be formally discussed with the family, but it was clear they needed to.
I understand, Ravi. I too want to capitalise on this opportunity, but we haven't had time to properly discuss the matter. I understand, Frank, and again allow me to express my condolences on the loss of your son. But I cannot wait much longer.
Frank nodded and strode towards the house.
I understand. I promise that by the 1st of February, I'll be able to give you a definite response one way or another. Good. That's very good. I do hope it will be a positive one. I enjoy working with you and would like to extend that relationship to benefit us both.
Frank took the steps 2 at a time, waving at Janella as he passed the kitchen where she was busily preparing lunch. Reaching the office, he stepped inside and closed the door before easing himself into his chair as Ravi continued to iterate the benefits of the proposed deal.
Yes, I agree. The prospect does sound promising. My family and I will discuss it and I'll have a firm answer by February 1st. You can count on it. Wonderful. I look forward to hearing from you then. Have a happy new year, Frank. You too, Ravi.
Frank ended the call and placed his phone on the desk. His gaze lingered on it for several long moments, his heart and mind warring. He wanted this opportunity. It was a chance to get back to more of what he was used to, cattle raising, and less tourism. Julian had loved the idea of turning the station into a tourist attraction to increase revenue. Frank had never loved the idea, but he'd acknowledged that it had worked out. In fact, it was still working. Plus, they didn't have space to run more cattle. Although large in size, the station was limited by the aridness of the land, and Ravi's proposal would stretch the station beyond a comfortable capacity if they wanted to produce quality beef. Frank was less than comfortable compromising quality for quantity, but still, the opportunity was a once-in-a-lifetime one. He had to at least propose it to the family. Perhaps they'd be happy to compromise a little. It wasn't ideal, but maybe that's what they'd have to do to snag the deal. Frank swiveled in his chair and stared out the window, his fingers massaging his chin. He sat for several minutes, considering his options and committing the whole situation to the Lord, when a knock sounded on the door. "Dad, are you there?" It was Joshua. "Yes, Josh, come in." Frank swiveled around and faced him. His son strode into the room, shirt sleeves folded above his elbows, shirt tucked in front but not in the back. "Are you busy?" "Well, somewhat, but never too busy for a chat. Is everything all right?" Joshua stepped in front of the chair on the other side of the desk and sat down and leaned forward. "Yes, kind of. But what's your problem? You look troubled." Frank's brow creased. His son wasn't normally so perceptive. He leaned back in his chair and folded his arms. "It's Ravi Tamala. I just got off the phone with him. He wants to know if we can meet his increased demand for processed beef. He went through the numbers again and it sounds very lucrative." Joshua's face brightened. "How lucrative?" "Extremely. We could do away with the tourism aspect of the station entirely and still have plenty of money to spare, only doing what we do best. The problem is, if we increase the herd by the number we'll need to, we risk the final product being malnourished." Joshua shook his head. "Stella would never allow that." "I know. Which is why I'm doubtful we can pursue this venture, no matter how much I'd like to." Joshua's chin lifted. "There is a way." Frank's gaze narrowed. "What do you mean?" Joshua took a long breath and sat back. "There's something I want to discuss with you. It's why I'm here." "Go ahead." "It has to do with Stella and Indigo. I've been thinking this over for a while now, and I want to buy the station back for her as a wedding present." Frank's eyes bulged. "You want to buy Indigo?" "Yes. Stella loves that station. If you hear her talk about her life there, you'd understand. It means so much to her, and I want her to be happy. Getting the station back would make her ecstatic." Frank shook his head and chuckled. "I thought marrying you would be enough to make her happy." "It is," Joshua said with a grin. "But I'd like to put a cherry on top." Frank drew a slow breath. "I see. Just how do you propose to buy the station? You don't have that much saved, do you?" "No. That's why I wanted to talk to you." Frank understood immediately. Joshua didn't have the cash for the purchase and wanted his help to secure the capital. "Joshua, I can't just buy a station because you want to make Stella happy. It has to make sense for the entire family." Joshua scooted forward in his seat. "But it does. You just said it. We can't add to the herd here, but we could have a herd at Indigo. The added space from that station would give us all the acreage we need to ensure the animals' well-being and fulfill the quota Tamala is looking for. Plus, it would make Stella happy." Silence filled the room as Frank considered Joshua's proposal. What he said made sense. Excellent sense, at least in theory. They would need to check the figures to see if it translated to dollars and cents. "Are you sure about this?" he finally asked. "I'm positive, Dad. I've thought it through and I think it's the best option for everyone." "What about the animals? Who'd look after them? You can't expect Stella to divide her time between 2 stations." "We can work that out," Joshua replied. "Even if we have to hire someone else to help manage the stock, it would still be worth it if Tamala's figures stack up, am I right?" Frank mulled the figures over in his head. The cost of a new vet was considerably less than the projected profits of the proposed venture. It would be more than worth it to hire another vet and take the deal. But there'd also be the cost of purchasing Indigo, although from what he'd heard, it was going cheap. Frank liked the idea more and more, but there were still a few questions that needed answering. "What about the 2 of you?" "What about us?" "If you buy the station for Stella, where would the 2 of you live, here or at Indigo?" Joshua dipped his head and studied his hands. Frank sensed what was coming. "I haven't given it much thought as yet. I wanted to talk things over with you first and confirm we can secure the property. I don't want Stella knowing anything about it yet, just in case things don't work out. I don't want her to be disappointed. But if it does..." He raised his head and met Frank's gaze. Joshua bit his lower lip, a childhood habit that lingered into adulthood. "I think it would work better if we stayed at Indigo. I think Stella would like that best." His Adam's apple bobbed as he held Frank's gaze. "I could manage things there." Frank nodded in silence. It was what he expected. He'd hoped Joshua and Stella would stay at Goddard Downs after they married, but perhaps this was an answer to prayer. And perhaps it would be good for them to be on their own for a while, rather than trying to find their way in the shadow of the family. They'd still be close enough and would be working closely with the family, if they were able to secure the property. It could be a win-win. That might work. Joshua's brows lifted and his expression brightened. "Thanks, Dad. I'm glad you understand." "I do. But before we get ahead of ourselves, we need to talk to the bank and find out what kind of trouble Indigo Downs was in and how much it would take to get it operational again." Joshua nodded. "When can we check with the bank?" "As soon as possible. First working day next week if we can get an appointment." Joshua's eyes sparkled. "I'll call and book us in." Although his eagerness cranked up Frank's own excitement, it also filled him with a certain amount of sadness. In all the years he'd longed for his son to be more involved in Goddard Downs, he hadn't foreseen that Joshua might take over the management of another station. That had come out of left field. Perhaps his eagerness stemmed from a need to escape the memories Goddard Downs held. It was a bitter thought, but one Frank had to acknowledge. He looked at his son as they sat silently together. Was Joshua running away again? Or was this truly the way forward? "Lord, please guide us." Chapter 14. Janella sat at the table with the rest of the family. They were all there, except for Joshua and Stella, and Janella wondered why. It wasn't long before she found out. "Ravi Tamala contacted me again today," Frank announced from the head of the table. All eyes turned to him. "The deal's still open, but only for a limited time. I promised I'd get back to him by the 1st of February, so we need to discuss his proposal now." Olivia raised her hand. "Where are Joshua and Stella? Shouldn't they be here?" Frank grimaced and shifted in his seat. "What I want to discuss intricately involves them, and that's why they aren't here." Olivia frowned. "I don't understand. Isn't that even more reason for them to be here?" "No, and here's why." Frank took a deep breath. "Today, Joshua proposed we buy Indigo Downs." Murmurs quickly moved around the table. Frank silenced them with a wave of his hand. Janella was too stunned to speak. "As I was saying, Joshua wants to buy Indigo Downs as a wedding present for Stella. We all know how much losing the station affected her and how hard she tried to get it back before finally giving up. Considering that, Joshua thought that buying it for her would kill two birds with one stone, so to speak. He could give her back her home, and we can have the additional acreage needed to add to our herd and fulfill Ravi's increased requirements." His gaze travelled around the table. "I'd like your honest thoughts." Was there no end to the madness? First, Joshua proposed to a woman he'd only dated for 4 months, and now he was planning to spend hundreds of thousands of dollars, if not millions, to buy an entire cattle station for her. It was insanity. Olivia spoke first. "I think it sounds like a plan. I'd have to look at the numbers, of course, and there would be some details we'd need to iron out, but if the numbers come back, I think it could be excellent for us." "I think so too," Nathan added. "Did he say who'd run the station?" "He and Stella would," Frank replied. Silence filled the room. "Joshua?" Nathan's brows lifted. He looked at Olivia, who seemed just as surprised as they all were. "He offered to run the station." "Yes," Frank answered. "He thought it would be best that way. He and Stella would live at Indigo." Would that mean Stella would go between stations? Maggie asked. Frank turned to her. No, she'd stay at Indigo. We'd have to hire a new vet for Goddard Downs. But wouldn't that be an expense? Janella's tongue had finally freed itself of its constraints. Not really. The profits from the deal would be more than enough to pay for a new vet, and it could even cover the cost of a manager. His last words dropped like stones. I thought you were managing things here, Olivia said, no doubt voicing what everyone was thinking. Frank glanced at Maggie before turning his gaze to Olivia. For a while. I don't know how long. It's not that I don't want to keep running this place. I do. However, I'm not getting any younger, and I have to confess that I was actually enjoying having less responsibility after Julian took over. I'll be happy to do it for a time, but at this stage of our lives... He paused and squeezed Maggie's hand. We want to spend more time together. Perhaps even do some travelling when the time's right. Janella's words once again locked in her throat. Joshua was planning to manage Indigo Downs, they'd need to hire another new vet, and Frank was thinking of getting a manager to run Goddard Downs. The world had turned upside down. She didn't know what to make of it. But Grandpa, you said one of us would always run Goddard Downs. If you don't do it, are you going to hire someone from outside? Caleb asked. Janella turned to her son. He had a valid question, one she was sure they were all thinking. Her brave boy had the gumption to ask it. She smiled proudly. Frank looked directly at Caleb. I don't want to hire just anyone. I want this place to always be in the hands of a Goddard, but right now there isn't one capable of taking the reins. I can do it. Caleb sat taller in his chair. Janella's eyes widened. Caleb, you can't take over the station, you're only a boy. Janella, Frank said softly, trying to allay her fears, no doubt. He smiled before he turned to Caleb. I'm glad to hear you say that, Caleb. I was wondering who'd take over once I became too old to run this place. Knowing that you want to take responsibility warms my heart and gives me hope for the future. Caleb smiled brightly. Janella placed her hand on her son's shoulder and batted back tears. Julian would have been so proud. I have a question, Olivia said. If we get involved in buying Indigo, who would it belong to? Would it be Stella's, since Joshua wants to buy it as a gift, or would it belong to the family? Yes, Janella asked, straightening. Who would it belong to? The details still need ironing out, but Indigo would become a subsidiary of this station. However, it would be owned by Joshua and Stella together. They'd own and run it. Olivia looked sharply at Nathan. As I said, things would need ironing out, but we do have time, Frank added quickly. The first thing we have to do is find out how much it would cost to buy Indigo. Joshua and I plan to go to Kununurra first thing next week and find out the details. You and Joshua seem to have talked this over at great length. Olivia's brow lifted. We had a few minutes earlier today, so we talked it over. I thought it was a good idea, but I wanted to bring it to the family. Joshua didn't want Stella to hear anything about it, which is why he took her out to check on some animals. He doesn't want her hopes raised only to have things fall through, or if we decide not to pursue the purchase. He wanted to give us a fair chance to discuss it without his influence. He also wanted me to say that we shouldn't consider the wedding or his motivations, but I think that's as integral to this decision as the profits. Why? Janella asked, her voice louder than she'd intended. Why is it so important? Everyone faced her and she felt a pang of discomfort. She didn't want to be the only pessimist in the room, but she had to ask. Because they're family, Frank answered gently, and we want the family to be happy. Having Indigo Downs would make Stella happy, and therefore Joshua. If they're happy, then we can be happy for them. What would it be like if we decided to buy the property but not allow Stella to live there? What would that turn family lunches into? Can you imagine how she'd feel? How Joshua would feel? Janella pursed her lips. Frank supported this venture, and the family would follow suit. No matter how much the others might want to protest, they'd follow Frank. He was the one they all looked to, the one they all counted on. If he said something, they rarely contradicted him. But today would be different. The meeting ended with the consensus that Olivia would check the numbers and they'd meet again to go over them before Frank and Joshua's trip to Kununurra. After the meeting, they'd make a final decision. Janella waited for the room to empty before she approached Frank. She ruffled Caleb's hair and kissed Sasha on the cheek before they left the room to play one of their new games. Janella wasn't very good at the new fandangled games. She liked Monopoly and Snakes and Ladders much better. Unfortunately, those games seemed rather boring to her children. She strode towards Frank. "Frank, may I speak with you a moment?" "Of course, Janella. How are you doing?" She swallowed her anxiety. "I'm fine. Can we talk?" Frank nodded. "Of course. Walk with me?" He took hold of her elbow and led her towards his office. She followed alongside silently. Did he know what she wanted to discuss? Was that why he was leading her there? Once inside the office, she took the seat across from him. "What is it, Janella?" He leaned forward and looked at her with a soft gaze. She wanted to suppress her feelings and keep them hidden, but it was difficult. Joshua and Stella's marriage, and now the plan of buying Indigo Downs, was a series of misadventures that was bound to end badly. She had to say something to stop it. She had to. Her words tumbled out in a rush. "This is all happening too quickly." Frank sighed. "Joshua and Stella, you mean?" She nodded. "They've hardly been together for 4 months and now they're getting married and Josh is buying a cattle station for her. It's too much. I think they're making a mistake." Frank's head tilted. "Why do you think that?" Her lips parted. Why did she think that? "Didn't you hear what I just said?" "I did, but those reasons don't make it a mistake. It might seem that things are happening fast, but that doesn't mean they're wrong." "Frank, hear me out." The gentle tone of Frank's voice made her want to give him a chance to share his views, though she doubted it would change hers. She folded her arms. "Go ahead. I know this is a difficult time for you. It's possible Joshua is rushing things, but I can understand why." "You do?" Janella's voice rose an octave. "I do. He doesn't want to waste time when he knows his heart, and I believe he does. I think I'd do the same under the circumstances. If losing Julian proved anything to me, it's that we don't know how many days are promised to us. We need to make every moment count. Don't you agree?" She was speechless. Had Frank lost his mind? But no. His feelings and desires for his family were sincere. He wanted the best for Joshua, she was sure of that. She simply wasn't sure that marrying Stella and moving to Indigo was the right choice. In fact, she believed the contrary was true. "Yes, but I truly think he's making a mistake. Do you remember when you and Julian asked for my and Esther's blessing on your engagement?" She nodded. She knew where this was going. They were so young at the time and no one thought their relationship would last, especially when Julian was away at school in Darwin, but Frank had supported them, given them his blessing. She doubted he would, since she had a totally different background to the Goddards, but he and Esther surprised them by saying that if she and Julian truly knew their minds, they had their blessing. What right did she have to withhold that from Joshua and Stella? "I'm sorry, Frank. I'm missing Julian so much. I think my loss is affecting how I think and feel." Her eyes misted over. "I understand." He handed her a tissue. "I know you do." She dabbed her eyes. "I'm sure they'd appreciate your support. Joshua thinks the world of you." She sniffed. "I'm not so sure about that, but I'll try." "I'm glad to hear that. And Janella." She met his gaze. "I think they'll be fine." She still wasn't so sure. Chapter 15. The house buzzed with activity and waves of anxiety swept through Janella, upsetting her stomach. Today, Maggie's family was returning to Darwin, and she and Caleb were going with them. It wasn't time for school to start yet, But Caleb was going early to familiarise himself with the city he was about to call home for the next 4 years. He'd be boarding at the school, but before he settled in, they were spending a few days with Jeremy and Emma. Maggie's son and his wife had very graciously offered them a place to stay while they explored the city. Janella wasn't familiar with Darwin, and she'd never had any great desire to go. She was content living at Goddard Downs. Big cities didn't interest her. But since Julian was unable to take this trip with Caleb, there was no option but for her to go instead. She placed a salmon-coloured blouse in the suitcase and then a pair of black jeans. She didn't know what to take. Jeremy had promised to take them out to dinner and show them the sights. She felt she was going to a foreign land where she didn't know the protocols, but she didn't want to offend, so she was taking almost her whole wardrobe. She wandered to the dresser and picked up a small bottle of perfume. It was a Christmas gift from Julian 3 years ago. Although she didn't wear perfume often, since she rarely went anywhere that warranted it, Julian insisted it would smell nice on her. He didn't buy her gifts often, so Janella cherished each one she received, even if they were items she wouldn't have chosen for herself. The bottle was beautiful, a pale blue glass in a star shape. She squeezed the nozzle, sending a light mist into the air. It smelled sweet, like berries and vanilla. She inhaled it deeply. I should have worn this more. It would have made Julian happy. She studied the bottle and was placing it in her suitcase when Caleb appeared in the doorway. He was dressed in a red t-shirt with a motorbike on the front and dark blue jeans, his favourite pair. The knees were scuffed and the hems were fraying, but he wouldn't part with them. Janella was sure he'd wear them until they no longer fit or they unwrapped themselves thread by thread. He raised a brow. "Mum, what are you doing?" "Packing. What does it look like?" "A mess." She frowned. "What do you mean?" "Nothing." He shrugged before sitting on the bed. "I thought you were taking a ride with your grandfather." "I was, but I decided to come back and help." He wriggled closer, looking glum-faced and at a loss. Her heart went out to him. Despite his offer of help, he didn't make any attempts to do so. "You aren't doing much to help," she said. "I'm trying to decide where to start. It's like you're packing the entire house for this trip." The comment made her pause. She looked at the bed, then at the empty hangers in the wardrobe, and chuckled. "I have taken everything out, haven't I?" "Yes. It looks like you're moving, not just going for a few days." Janella sighed. "I don't know what I was thinking." Caleb tilted his head. "Are you nervous, Mum?" She drew a slow breath and nodded. It was no use denying it. "Yes. So am I." She met her son's gaze. Trepidation filled his dark brown eyes. Not surprising. He was venturing into an entirely new life, leaving everything familiar behind, and she wouldn't be there to support him. She couldn't imagine how that felt, especially having just lost his father. She stood and walked around the bed. Sitting beside Caleb, she wrapped an arm around his shoulders and pulled him close, like she used to do when he was a little boy. "You don't have to worry, Caleb. You'll be fine. I know you will." "But I don't know anyone. What if I don't like it?" "You will," she assured him, praying she was right. "I'm not Dad, you know." "I know you're not. You're your own person, Caleb." "But what if I don't do well? What if I fail?" His anxiety tugged at her heart. He wanted so much to make Julian proud. It was all he ever wanted to do. "You don't have to be your father, Caleb. You make me proud every single day just by being yourself. You don't have to have the same experiences your dad had while he was at school. You'll make your own, and they'll be special." "I'm scared." "Oh, Caleb, don't be." Lifting his head from her shoulder, she placed her hands on both of his and peered into his eyes. "Do you remember what God told Joshua? Have I not commanded you? Be strong and courageous. Do not be afraid. Do not be discouraged, for the Lord your God will be with you wherever you go." Although I won't be with you, God will be with you the whole time, and He can look after you far better than I can. I know, but I still worry about fitting in. Janella blinked back tears. Don't worry about that, I'm sure you'll be fine. I'm not so sure. I'll be different. I won't act like the other boys, I won't even look like them. His voice cracked as he spoke. None of that matters. It does, Mum. I don't want to go. I want to stay here with you. I don't see why. Tears filled Janella's eyes, silencing her son mid-sentence. I have no doubt you're going to do amazingly well at school, Caleb. What others think of you is of no consequence, but I'm sure you'll make some great friends and you'll have a wonderful time. Being the daughter of a stockman, she hadn't had the opportunity of going to a school like Julian had, and although the prospect of being separated from her son for months at a time filled her with great sadness, it was an opportunity he couldn't pass up, even if he didn't want to go. What if I get bullied? Janella winced. She and Julian had discussed that possibility. Being partly Indigenous and dark-skinned certainly provided an opportunity for any boy who had it in him to bully another, but that wasn't a reason for Caleb not to go to school. Caleb, the school has an anti-bullying policy. If it happens, it will be dealt with immediately. But you have to remember that the colour of your skin doesn't define who you are. You're a Goddard of Goddard Downs. But more than that, you're a much-loved and precious child of the King. You can hold your head high at all times and be proud of who you are. Okay? He nodded slowly. You'll be fine. I promise. She ran her fingers through his hair, ruffling it. You can do anything you put your mind to, just like your father. You're a strong boy, Caleb. When tears welled in his eyes, she hugged him to her and prayed softly. Lord, look after my little boy. I entrust him into your care. Bless him with every good thing and give him peace. Her chest heaved. Give us both peace. It would be so easy to allow him to stay, but she had to be strong for him, although her heart was breaking. Despite Janella's anxiety, she and Caleb loved Darwin. It was a change they both needed, but before they knew it, she'd be back at Goddard Downs and he'd be settling into school. They took in all that Darwin had to offer, especially the sunsets at Mindle Beach after wandering through the markets, where they tried all types of street food and listened to buskers playing instruments they'd never seen or heard. It was a far cry from the peace and serenity of Goddard Downs with its wide open spaces. But walking along a sandy beach and gazing out across the vast sea filled them both with a sense of God's greatness. The day soon came when Janella had to leave Caleb at the school. Jeremy and Emma had driven them past the complex on several occasions, so they were at least partly prepared when they'd gone inside and spoken to the woman at the reception desk. She'd been helpful but said the accommodation block was having some renovations done and wouldn't be ready until the specified date, so it couldn't be viewed. But they were welcome to wander the grounds. Julian had told Janella about the fields where he'd played football and cricket as a student, but she had no real concept of how vast they were, nor how green, until she saw them with her own eyes. She had no doubt that Caleb would excel at sport, and that sport might be his saving grace. Not that he wasn't bright, but she was sure he'd prefer kicking a ball than studying algorithms, whatever they were. He stayed close to her as they wandered through the grounds of the school that sat high on a hill and offered amazing views across Fanny Bay. She could easily picture Julian here, chatting with his friends, kicking a ball around. Melancholy threatened to overwhelm her again. She grabbed Caleb's elbow and headed for the exit. Are you okay, Mum? She nodded, a little too quickly. I will be. 2 days later, they sat in Jeremy and Emma's living room waiting for Jeremy. The day had finally come. Her knees bounced up and down and her hands kneaded over each other. She closed her eyes. Lord, help me do this. Help me let Caleb go. Despite her bravado, she felt anything but strong. She knew what she had to do and wanted to do it, but her heart and head were at war. Part of her wanted to keep Caleb close and safe. The other wanted him to go out and become the man he was meant to be. "Jer will only be a few more minutes. He's finally off the phone," Emma apologised for the third time as she set a tray of juice and croissants on the coffee table and joined Janella on the couch. "It's all right," Janella assured her. Caleb reached for a croissant, but she was too nervous to eat anything. "You're not hungry?" Emma asked. Janella shook her head. "Anxious?" She nodded. Caleb finished his croissant in 2 bites. Emma's children were playing outside in the small backyard, their sounds of laughter drifting into the house. The size of the backyard had surprised Janella. At Goddard Downs, the children's play area was immense, not confined by fences and brick walls. She had no idea how children could ever be happy in a yard this small, but they seemed to be. She knew Caleb was itching to kick a ball around to help calm his nerves, so she patted him on the leg. "You can go outside and wait if you want." "Can I?" She nodded and gave a smile. He leapt to his feet and headed out the door. "He's a great boy," Emma said as he closed the door behind him. "He is." Emma poured a glass of juice for herself. "He'll do great here. You don't need to worry." "Who said I was worried?" "Your hands. If you need them any more, they'll be ready for baking." Emma's eyes twinkled. Janella quickly stopped her nervous action. "I suppose I am a little anxious." "It's understandable. He's leaving you for the first time. I admire you for maintaining your cool for so long. I would have been in tears a long time ago." A grateful smile spread across Janella's face. "Thanks for saying that. I thought I would be by now, but I've been trying to stay calm for Caleb's sake. He doesn't need to see me cry again." Emma nodded slowly. "I imagine he's seen a lot of that recently." "Yes, he has. I promise we'll check on him regularly. We won't leave him alone, Janella. We'll be there for him if he ever needs us." Emma's words gave some comfort, but anxiety still lingered in Janella's heart. Be anxious for nothing. He's nervous about fitting in. Be anxious for nothing. He'll do just fine. Everyone feels they won't fit in at first, but I'm sure he'll be okay. I hope so. It's harder because he's just lost his father, Janella replied. And he's worried because he's partly Indigenous and most of the other boys won't be. Once again, she prayed he wouldn't be judged by the colour of his skin. I know, and that's hard. But he's a Goddard, Janella. He knows he's loved, and he's stronger than you think. Janella met Emma's soft gaze. They were as different as 2 women could be. Emma was a city girl, born and bred. Janella, the daughter of a stockman, born and raised on the land, and yet they shared a bond. They were both daughters of the king. I know we don't know each other very well, but I'd love to pray with you. Would you let me? Janella nodded. I'd appreciate that, thank you. Emma reached her hands out and waited for Janella to take them. She placed her hands into Emma's and closed her eyes as the other woman began to pray. Lord, thank you for your mercy and grace. I bring my sister in Christ, Janella, before you. Grant her peace, dear Lord. Calm her nerves. Let her entrust Caleb into your care, knowing that your love for him is beyond measure. Help her not to fear. Ease her pain and loss, for I know she still mourns her husband. Father, may your love and joy envelop her and keep her in perfect peace. In Jesus' name we pray. Amen. Amen, Janella echoed as she opened her eyes. A warm smile filled Emma's face as she leaned forward and gave her a hug. Thank you. I needed that. You're more than welcome. God bless you, Janella. Footsteps sounded on the tiled floor and Janella straightened. Sorry to interrupt, Jeremy said, standing tall in the hallway. It's okay. I think I'm ready, Janella said, pushing to her feet. Chapter 16. The smell of melting cheese filled the kitchen as Maggie poured the morning tea, humming the tune of one of her favourite worship songs while Frank got dressed for the day.
"Smells wonderful out there,"
he called from the bedroom. Maggie smiled. "Thank you." Their morning routine was one of her favourite moments of each day. Since Julian's death, there were fewer days when they stayed in late, but the few they had were wonderful. Today was one of those. It was 9 o'clock, though the sky would never give that away. Thick clouds blocked the sun's rays, giving the feeling of early morning. She looked out the window and wished she had a different view. A view of the ocean, perhaps. Months ago, she and Frank discussed taking an extended vacation, returning to Broome where they'd had their honeymoon, and then driving down the coast road to Perth. Julian's passing had derailed their plans, and since then, the subject hadn't been discussed again. But a deep longing to be away with Frank filled her. It wasn't realistic at the moment, but one day soon, maybe it would be. He entered the room, a grin on his face as he strode towards her. He stole her breath away. He wore an off-white button-down shirt open at the neck, smart dark trousers, and shiny black shoes. He also smelled of soap and the subtle woodsy cologne she'd given him for Christmas. He wrapped his arms around her from behind and nuzzled her neck. "How's the best cook in the area doing?" She laughed, leaning into him. "I don't know. Janella's up at the house."
"Very funny."
Tightening his embrace, he kissed her temple. "I meant you, of course." A smile lifted Maggie's lips. "I'm doing very well." "How's the best husband doing?"
"I don't know. Nathan's at the house with Olivia."
She faced him and swatted his arm lightly. "Now who's the kidder?"
"Oh, what's life without a little laughter?"
Frank released her and, rounding the table, sat down and watched as she lit one of the stove burners and sprayed the frying pan with butter-flavoured oil before setting it over the flame. "Sausages?" Frank nodded.
"Yes, thanks. What's in the oven?"
"Vegetable quiche. I thought we could use a change. I found a recipe in a magazine I wanted to try." She took the tray of sausages from the fridge and dropped 4 into the pan. They sizzled immediately. She stepped back as she pushed the sausages around to coat them with the oil. "Are you ready for today?"
"As much as I can be. Olivia gave us the figures we need. If the banks are minimal, we should be able to progress with the purchase. It should only take a few weeks to get the approval, but you know how things can be with banks and mortgages. Sometimes they require a kidney and a left arm before they give the go-ahead, but I'm sure they'll see the merit of the deal as much as we do, and they'll give us the loan. I wish we could buy it outright, though. I dislike being in debt."
"The borrower is slave to the lender," Maggie commented. The Book of Proverbs held many insights about life, finance, and relationships. She tried to use it as a guide for her life, but she wasn't always consistent about it.
"I know," Frank replied. "That's why I had Olivia draft a repayment plan. I don't want them robbing us with interest and a loan term longer than we need."
Maggie nodded. "That's very smart. I'm sure the bank will love that."
"No, they won't, but it should look good when we make the presentation. 5 years and not a day more."
Frank stood and began to set the table. She loved him for that. She never had to ask. He always offered to help and often acted before she even told him what she wanted. 5 years? Maggie exclaimed.
"Yes." He walked around to the drawers to get the cutlery. "Olivia believes our cash flow will allow that."
The timer on the oven chimed. Maggie turned it off and pulled the pan from the oven, placing it on a cooling rack to let the mini quiches rest a moment before serving them. She grabbed 2 large white plates and dished out the sausages before placing 2 of the cupcake-sized quiches on each plate. She then fetched the sliced fruit from the fridge. She'd arranged the slices of mango, honeydew and oranges in a pretty design, and they looked scrumptious. "Toast?" she asked.
"No, thanks," Frank replied. "Finished with those?"
He gestured to the plates on the counter. "Yes, I'll grab the tea." He headed to the counter and carried the plates to the table while she collected the teapot, cups and saucers and placed them in the middle between them. After they were both seated, he took her hand and squeezed it before they closed their eyes while he gave thanks for the meal. They began eating, but after a few minutes, Maggie set her cutlery down and poured the tea. "I've been thinking about something," she said as she placed a cup in front of him. "And what's that, my love?" "Do you remember the idea we had about going back to Broome?" "Of course," he said, wrapping his hands around the cup. "I know this might be ill-timed, but I couldn't help thinking about it again." "It was a good plan, wasn't it? I'd love to go back for a few weeks and then road trip down the coast." "Yes, it was. Is," Maggie said while thoughts of lazing on the sun-filled beach drifted through her mind and filled her with longing. Frank reached across the table and squeezed her hand. "Then why don't we do it?" "What, now? With everything going on?" "There'll always be things going on. Maybe we can go to Broome for a few days right now. We can go for a longer time later." "Should I call the travel agent?" "Let's wait until after the meeting with the bank. Once that's settled, I'll feel better." She reached out and squeezed his hand. "I hope it goes well." "So do I. It's going to be touch and go getting an answer in time for Ravi's deadline." Since everything had slowed down over the holiday period, they'd had to wait another week to get an appointment at the bank, putting their plans behind. Breakfast continued, and Maggie relished the time spent alone with Frank. Having the family visit for the holidays was wonderful, but she'd missed the quiet mornings with her husband. She was sad to see her family go, and she knew she'd miss them all, especially the grandchildren. It was a pity they lived so far away. Once they finished eating, Maggie washed up while Frank answered a phone call. With her spirits raised by the prospect of even a few days in Broome becoming a possibility, she hummed as she walked back to the table to wipe it. She stopped mid-wipe as she caught a bit of the conversation going on in the other room. "Move here? Are you sure? You and Serena have talked this through?" Maggie's eyes widened. What? David and Serena were talking of moving here? To Goddard Downs? She scurried to the other room, dish rag in hand. Frank looked up and waved her over. Their gazes met as he continued talking. "Well, if you're both sure that's what you want, we'd appreciate all the help we can get." Frank nodded as he squeezed her hand. "Yes, it will make Maggie happy. I'm surprised Serena hasn't already told her." He laughed. "I see. Taking the lead on this, are you? I respect your desire to get my okay before getting Maggie's hopes up. Having the three of you living on the station would mean the world to her." Maggie's mind raced. Serena hadn't mentioned moving to Goddard Downs during their recent visit. This had come out of left field. Where would they live? What would they do? Would Serena be happy living so far from the city? How would she do her talks? "Yes, I'll tell Maggie right away. I'm sure she and Serena will have plenty to talk about. I think we can leave the moving details to them." Chuckling, Frank looked up and smiled. He wrapped an arm around her hips and pulled her onto his lap. "We'll talk more soon. Bye, David." Joy bubbled inside her. "Tell me I wasn't dreaming it. David and Serena are thinking of moving here." "Yes," Frank nodded. "It seems they've been discussing it for a while and thought this was the perfect time to make the move. Serena's been talking to some schools in Kununurra and they're keen for her to speak to their students. She mentioned it to me, but I didn't know it was going ahead. In fact, Serena had downplayed it and Maggie had assumed the schools weren't interested in her life skills presentation." "So they're really coming?" "Yes, they are." "Will the others approve?" "Of course. Why wouldn't they? We'll need extra help when Joshua and Stella take over Indigo. Plus, they're family." Maggie's skin tingled with excitement. She could never have prayed for something as wonderful as this. Having Serena close by and little Oliver especially was an absolute dream. She'd get to see him grow up and be on hand to help Serena whenever she needed it. "Oh, this is such good news, Frank." He kissed her cheek and hugged her. "I thought it might make your day." "It's done that and more." But would it mean they'd need to postpone their trip to Broome again? Probably. How could they go away, even for a few days, when there was so much to do? Chapter 17. Within days, plans for Serena and David's move were well underway. Janella was back from Darwin, but far from herself. Caleb's departure brought with it a further dampening of her spirits. Maggie wondered if more was bothering her than Julian's passing or Caleb's departure. Not that either of those were minor. Even on their own, either would cause a person to struggle. But Janella was a strong woman of faith. It was out of character for her to be morose and out of sorts for so long. Standing in the kitchen garden, Maggie could see her outline through the window. Her head was down, as were her shoulders, as she chopped a pumpkin with such force Maggie worried for the safety of her fingers. Since her return from Darwin, Janella seemed different. She talked less, even to Maggie. Plus, she spent less time with the family, except for Sasha. When it came to her daughter, Janella was always close. Still, Maggie was concerned. The other woman's retreat into herself was distressing not only to her, but to the rest of the family, Frank especially. He'd shared with her that Janella wasn't keen on the wedding or the purchase of indigo, that she considered both a mistake, and that's what was making her unhappy. Frank's words repeated in Maggie's mind as she studied Janella. Should she say something? Would it help or only make things worse? Janella was still mourning, and Joshua was moving forward. Their feelings were at odds, and Maggie understood that. She was sure Janella didn't want to put a damper on the wedding plans, but she couldn't pretend to be happy either. If Maggie did speak up, what would she say? And would it help? She exhaled deeply. Lord, Janella's mourning and struggling with everything. Please help her. Help her, Caleb and Sasha. We all miss Julian, but they feel his absence the most. I pray that each passing day will bring them closer to your peace. We don't understand why you allowed him to die when he was in his prime, but help us not to question you, but to trust. Please guide and lead me as I go inside and speak with Janella as I feel I must. Give me the right words to say that I might be a blessing to her in some small way. In Jesus' precious name, Amen. The end of her prayer set Maggie's steps in motion. She walked to the door, entered the house, and made her way to the kitchen. Hi, Janella. Maggie, Janella replied, looking up. Can I help you with something? Yes. Would you sit with me? Janella's brows pinched, but she did as Maggie asked, walking over to the table and taking a seat. What is it? Is something wrong? Worry etched her dark eyes. I think there is, Maggie said, praying once again for guidance. It's not Caleb, is it? Did something happen to Caleb? Her voice rose an octave. No, of course not. He's fine as far as I know. I'm sorry, I didn't mean to worry you. Maggie gulped. She'd already upset her dear friend. Daughter-in-law, actually. What is it then? I'm worried about you. Maggie leaned forward and took her hand. You aren't yourself, Janella. We can all see it and we're worried. Janella straightened, her chin lifting. Don't be. I'm okay. Besides, there's the wedding and the purchase of indigo for everyone to be thinking about. No one needs to worry about me. There was a hint of bitterness in her tone, but Maggie didn't call her on it. That doesn't mean we don't have time to care about you. I know life has been difficult, and Caleb going off to school has probably caused your feelings to intensify. I just wanted to know if there was anything I can do. Janella's eyes flickered. She seemed uncomfortable, as if Maggie's questions unsettled her. Maggie sat quietly, waiting for her to reply. Finally, she said, Janella? I'm sorry. Janella turned her head away. I'm a little distracted. I can understand that. Is there anything I can do to help? Maybe do more here? She shook her head defiantly. I can handle it. I need to keep busy. I understand, Maggie said gently. Being busy does help distract your mind for a time. She nodded. Yes, that, and I feel useful when I'm helping. You don't have to be useful now, Janella. Anyone would understand if you needed time to yourself here and there. I don't want time to myself, she retorted. Every night when I go to bed, I'm alone. And that's when it's the worst. I need to be doing things. Her voice faltered and tears flooded her eyes. Maggie rubbed her back. You'll get through this. I know you will. Janella swiped at her eyes. I know. It just doesn't feel like it on most days. The confession was hard to hear, but Maggie understood. Loss wasn't something you got over quickly, like a common cold. It was a series of waves so strong at first you think you're going to drown, and just when you think you'll survive, another one comes from nowhere and dumps on you. Gradually, however, the waves ease and you survive. Janella would once again float, but right now, she was still being dumped on. You're a strong woman, Janella, but you don't have to do this on your own. We're all here to help in whatever way we can. And don't forget the words in Psalm 46. God is our refuge and strength, a very present help in trouble. Maggie met Janella's gaze and smiled. I know. It's what I tell the kids all the time. I need to apply it to myself. I think we're all guilty of not taking our own advice at times. Would you mind if I prayed for you? Tears flooded her eyes again. That would be lovely. Thank you. Placing her hand gently on Janella's back, Maggie paused to centre her thoughts before she began. Heavenly Father, you know the pain Janella's carrying, the sense of aloneness she feels, and the weight of responsibility for her children that's fallen on her now Julian's gone. Lord, I ask that you give her an extra dose of comfort. Let her feel your loving arms around her, and let her know she's not alone, ever. She can call on you at any time of day or night, and you will hold her up and strengthen her. Lord, bless her, I pray. In Jesus' precious name. Amen. Maggie gave her a hug. You'll come out on the other side of this, Janella. I know you will. I hope so, Maggie. I truly do. That evening, Frank was still at the office going over numbers with Olivia and Joshua following a phone call from the bank, while Maggie sat on the veranda engrossed in a book. When her phone rang, she knew it was Serena from the ringtone. She set her book down and answered. Hello, sweetheart. Hi, Mum. How's everything? Oliver's gurgling in the background made Maggie smile. Good. How are you doing? Trying to get everything packed to move isn't easy with Oliver demanding my attention all the time. David's been called in to do some emergency work before we leave town. He couldn't really turn the money down. I guess not. Although they were being welcomed with open arms at Goddard Downs, it was still uncertain what role David would play on the station, and therefore his remuneration package was still up in the air. It was a step of faith, one they all felt was of God, but that didn't mean he shouldn't prepare beforehand. I'm looking forward to having you here, Maggie said. We're getting excited about it too. Not long to go now. In between everything, I've been thinking about my plans. Yes, Maggie smiled. It was so heartwarming to hear her daughter so enthusiastic again after the challenges she'd been through. She was such an inspiration. It came to me the other day that perhaps Janella could help me with my speaking engagements. She's Indigenous, and the schools I'll be working with have a high Indigenous enrolment. I think the kids would relate to her better than they would me. I think we'd make a great team, if she's interested. I was thinking of asking her about it when I get there, but I thought I'd run the idea past you first. Tears stung Maggie's eyes. How good was God? He knew what Janella needed better than anyone. Helping Indigenous kids find their way would be right up her alley. I think that's a great idea, sweetheart. I'm so glad you think so. I think it'll be a good distraction for her. I know the children were her distraction in keeping up with her work there, but with Caleb gone now, I imagine there's a void that needs filling. And I think she'd be great with the kids. Hope swelled in Maggie's chest. If this worked, it could be great not only for Janella but the children Serena was trying to mentor. It could be a wonderful experience for them all, if Janella agreed. Maybe Janella could teach me a thing or two as well, Serena added. Like what? Maggie asked. How to cook, for a start. I'm still working on that and it isn't going well. Maggie chuckled. I see. Well, perhaps when you move here, you can arrange some cooking lessons with her. I'm sure David would love that. I think he gets tired of doing all the cooking or ordering takeout. I'll mention it to her. Great, thank you. So, should I talk to her before we arrive or when I get there about helping me out? Maggie drew a slow breath. Why don't you wait until you get here? I think a personal invitation would be better, don't you? She leaned against the back of her chair and tucked some loose strands of hair behind her ear. Okay, I'll talk to her then. The soft gurgling Maggie heard before had turned into a loud cry. I'll have to call you back. Oliver's fussing. It's time for him to nurse. Maggie smiled. Kiss him for me. I can't wait to see you all. I love you, Serena. I love you too, Mum. Maggie ended the call and sighed happily. God had a way of taking care of things in ways she would never expect. Thank you, Lord. If this is of you, please let Janella be amenable and open to it. Let her see that sometimes you open doors and provide opportunities we would never dream of taking. But if we trust you and walk in faith, blessings abound. She knew that firsthand. Never in a million years had she expected to find such happiness and joy after her first marriage failed, and yet here she was, married to a wonderful man who loved her dearly, living in a place she could only describe as heaven on earth. God was indeed good. Chapter 18. Joshua and Nathan were hunched over a map of the area, planning the next cattle drive. After Sean disappeared months earlier, Nathan had reluctantly volunteered to take his place and help Joshua out. Do you think Frank will keep the drives going if you take over Indigo? Nathan questioned as he studied the map. They were considering changing the route, but Joshua was also wondering whether having tourist cattle drives would make sense at Indigo as well. He was more inclined to keep the station strictly about raising cattle, assuming the bank approved the loan, but he wasn't sure what his father would think. He shrugged. I'm not sure. Come on, Josh, you have to have some idea. You and Frank have been huddled close on this plan for weeks, especially after the meeting with the bank. Surely it's come up. A lot of things have come up, Nate. It doesn't mean anything's been decided. Joshua traced his finger over the drive route, snaking the way along the mountain range as he considered where to deviate the route for the next drive. He was hoping the change would help improve the experience, but also end his boredom. Liv still can't believe I'm doing this, Nathan chuckled, lifting his hat and running his hand across his damp hair. I'm glad you stepped in, and I'm sorry for dropping the ball so many times. I'm doing things differently now. I can see that. Nathan leaned back in his chair and folded his arms over his chest. Getting hooked up with Stella has been a good thing for you. Yep, she's my motivation, all right. As he thought of her, warmth spread through him. They were planning on travelling to Cootamundra that weekend to finally break the news to her parents. He couldn't wait, although a little voice in the back of his mind kept telling him they might not approve. I'm happy for you. I just wonder about the timing of your engagement. Joshua stiffened. Here we go. You mean with Julian's death? Nathan nodded slowly. I was wondering when someone would mention that. Joshua grimaced and leaned back. I knew some people might think it inappropriate, but Julian's death made me realise how fleeting life is, and I didn't want to put things off I was sure about. I wanted to take the bull by the horns, so I proposed. There had to be a bull in it, Nathan chuckled. Joshua relaxed a little and chuckled with him. Of course. Well, who can argue with that? They laughed together, and it felt good. How long had it been since they'd done that? A year? 2? More? Joshua lived in his own world most of the time. his secluded headspace that didn't involve his family. Now, with Sean gone and his priorities changed, he was seeing how much he'd neglected those relationships. "You hungry?" Joshua folded the map. Even if Nate wasn't, he was famished. They could get a bite and come back to planning later. "Always," Nathan chortled. They stood together and, leaving the maps on the table, headed to the kitchen. "Think Janella left any of that pie from yesterday?" "I hope so," Joshua replied. "I've got a hankering for it, something fierce. And perhaps some of those cookies too." "You do know that we should eat something proper and that this isn't considered a meal but a snack," Nathan said. "I know, which is why it's good. It won't ruin our appetite for dinner. I heard Janella's making lasagna, and I always like to have 2 or 3 helpings of that." "Me too," Nathan commented as they reached the kitchen. Olivia was there and greeted them with an amused expression. "You two look chummy," she said. Joshua stepped around her while Nathan stopped to kiss her cheek. "Something strange about that?" Joshua asked. "No." She sipped a glass of water. "Just surprising. I don't remember the last time I saw you both together like this." The 2 men exchanged glances. Nathan spoke first. "Josh and I have been coming to a better understanding, haven't we?" "Yes, we have," Joshua replied, smiling. He opened the bread box and took out the cookies while Nathan stepped around Olivia and grabbed the apple pie from the fridge and set it on the table. "Do you want it warmed?" "Nah, cold's fine," Joshua replied. "Cut me a slice too," Olivia said as she stepped closer to Joshua, ruffling his hair as she used to when they were children. "Don't get my husband fat or I'll have to pummel you." "Me?" Joshua said, raising his hands in the air in surrender. "How could I do any such thing?" "By feeding him cookies and pie. You might have the metabolism of an 18-year-old, but he doesn't." "Hey," Nathan said defensively. "It's true, love. I know you don't like to admit it, but it's true." She slipped her arms around her husband's waist and kissed his cheek. Nathan wasn't what you'd call overweight, but his girth was certainly larger than Joshua's. All of a sudden, Joshua had an insight into what it might be like to be married. It hadn't been real until now, but here, joking around with his sister and brother-in-law, he saw into the future. Would his girth broaden? Would he and Stella still be in love in 10 years' time? Would they still look at each other like Olivia and Nathan looked at each other? He'd heard they'd experienced some troubles a while back, but you wouldn't know by watching them now. "Are you sure you're ready?" A small voice hissed in his ear. "You haven't known her long. You don't even know what kind of toothpaste she uses, and you want to get married? You'll mess it up. You'll ruin it." Joshua shook away the thoughts. "I won't have any of that. I'll make it work. It's what I want." He got the plates and the knife, cut a peach of pie for each of them and set it aside. Olivia warmed hers, while both he and Nathan ate theirs cold. He stuck his fork into the pie and slid it into his mouth. It was sweet, but not too sweet, and he couldn't help but think it was the same way his life was going. He was happy, but things still lingered on the periphery that could dampen his contentment. He'd feel better once he had Stella's parents' approval, for one. Also when they knew if Indigo would be theirs or not. Chapter 19. They'd finally arrived. Stella and Joshua had begun their trip to her parents' home in Cootamundra that morning before the first rays of sunlight began lightening the sky. Frank had flown them to Kununurra in the helicopter, and from there they flew to Canberra via Perth and Sydney. They'd hired a car to drive the 100 or so kilometres to the small town of Cootamundra, and now, pulling up outside her parents' home, the sun was low in the sky. A whole day had passed. She reached out and squeezed Joshua's hand. "Are you ready?" He gave a nod and lifted her hand before kissing it and meeting her gaze. With nothing to do but talk with each other for the entire day, they'd shared their anxieties and concerns as the plane soared above the vast land below. How would her parents react to their announcement? When would the wedding be? Where would the wedding be? Did they want children? And if so, when? They'd decided they could do little about her parents' reaction other than let it play out. Stella hoped and prayed they'd love Joshua. She couldn't imagine they wouldn't. How could anyone not love him? He was the most lovable person she knew, and each day she was learning to love him more. They agreed that the wedding should be soon, since there was no reason to wait. They knew their hearts and minds and simply wanted to be husband and wife. There was no need for a long, drawn-out engagement, and besides, they both sensed that a wedding would help the family get over their grief. Not that they'd ever get over losing Julian, but life moved on, and a wedding was the perfect antidote to sadness. Deciding on the venue had been easy, since neither wanted a big, flashy do. The wide, open spaces of Goddard Downs would be more than perfect. The decision about children was the most difficult. Joshua said he didn't feel qualified to be a father. But Stella dug deeper, and he finally admitted the thought scared him. "What do I know about raising a child?" She'd squeezed his hand and said they'd learn together. When she told him that he'd had more experience with babies and young children than she had, since she was an only child and he had siblings and nieces and nephews, he seemed to relax a bit and warmed to the idea. "But let's not hurry," he said. "I want to have you all to myself for a while. Is that selfish?" She'd laughed and said no. She wasn't ready either. God will know when we're ready, and he'll bless us in his time, not before. Their gazes held as his lips lingered on her hand, but a movement caught Stella's attention. She turned and looked at the house. Her mother had opened the door and was bounding down the steps. "Stella, you're here!" She held her arms wide as Stella opened the car door and climbed out. Yes, at last. It seemed like we were never going to get here. She walked into her mother's embrace and hugged her before waving Joshua over and slipped her arm around his waist. "Mum, you remember Josh?" Her mother looked him up and down. "You've grown a bit since I saw you last, but nice to see you again." "And nice to see you, Mrs. Martin." He stepped forward and shook her extended hand. "Let's do away with the formalities. Call me Gloria. Now come inside and freshen up. You must be tired after your long journey." "A little," he said, winking at Stella as he picked up their bags and followed her mother inside. She showed them to their rooms. Stella had the room she'd stayed in over Christmas, while Joshua had the guest room down the hall. "I know this isn't a very modern idea, separate rooms, but in this house, we don't believe in sharing a bedroom before marriage. You understand, don't you?" "Of course," Joshua said, placing his bag on the floor beside the single bed. "This is perfect, thank you." Standing in the hallway, Stella smiled at how polite Joshua was with her mother. Not that she'd expected anything less. He was a Goddard, and although he'd gone off the rails for a time, he'd been raised to respect women and knew how to behave. She was so proud of him. Her finger subconsciously played at the spot where, up until an hour earlier, her ring had been. They decided she shouldn't wear it around her family until they made the announcement, and despite the short time she'd been wearing it, it felt strange for it to be missing. She couldn't wait to tell her parents, although her nerves tensed immediately at the thought. "We planned to go out for dinner if that's okay with you," her mother said, facing Stella. "Oh, that's fine, but where's Dad?" "He's meeting us at the restaurant. He got held up at work." "What time's the booking?" 6:30, but it's okay if we're a bit late." "Just as well, since it's after 6 now," Stella said, glancing at her watch. "Give us a few minutes to freshen up and change. Where are we going?" "The new Indian restaurant in the middle of town. I hope that's all right." Stella smiled. "Oh, sounds lovely." "Great. I'll feed the cat and then we'll go as soon as you're ready." Her mother smiled and proceeded down the hall, patting Stella's arm as she passed. "See, everything's great," Joshua whispered, grinning. Stella chuckled, stole a quick kiss, then headed to the bathroom. Stella spotted her father as she, Joshua, and her mother strolled towards the restaurant. It seemed that all of Cootamundra was in town, and the only parking spot they could find was a 5-minute walk away. Not that it mattered. It was a nice evening for a stroll now the heat of the day had dissipated. The streetlights had started to come on, and everybody they passed seemed to be in a happy mood. It was Friday night in downtown Cootamundra, but more than that, it was rodeo weekend. How had her mother not told her the rodeo was on when they were figuring out when to come? It didn't matter, she guessed. In fact, it might be a good test for Joshua. Would he be able to watch without regretting not participating? He'd told her his rodeo days were behind him, but she had an inkling that given the chance, he'd be out there in a flash. Not that she minded, so long as he didn't get hurt. But there were never any guarantees. Even in her short time on the circuit as an attending vet, how many accidents had she witnessed? Far too many. Her dad waved as they approached. He was wearing tan trousers and a white, long-sleeved shirt open at the neck. He looked much smarter than he'd ever looked when they lived at Indigo. Stella waved back, and when they reached each other, she greeted him with a kiss on the cheek. "Hi, Dad. Good to see you."
"And you, love. You look nice."
He smiled as he held her shoulders and appraised her outfit. She was wearing a sleeveless baby blue jumpsuit that Joshua liked. "Thanks, Dad. You don't look too bad yourself." They shared a smile and then she stepped back, reaching out for Joshua's hand. "Do you remember Joshua?" Nodding, her father extended his hand and looked up. Joshua towered over him. Stella often wondered where she'd gotten her height from, since both her parents were on the short side.
"Good to see you, son. You've certainly grown up since I last saw you. You were knee-high to a grasshopper back then."
"Thank you, Mr. Martin." Joshua shook his hand and smiled. He'd told her he didn't really remember her parents. He would have only been 5 the last time they'd come to Goddard Downs, and his memories were sketchy at best, although he did have memories of a little girl with long, flowing hair.
"Please call me Jim," her father said. "We should go inside. They've held our booking because I said you were coming. They're very busy tonight."
It was slow getting out of Canberra. There was some kind of demonstration going on, otherwise we would have been here half an hour earlier, Joshua said as her dad held the door open. The aroma of heady spices filled the room and made Stella's stomach growl. She'd eaten very little all day and was feeling the repercussions of that now. The restaurant was authentically decorated with deep crimson tablecloths on each of the tables, dark timber chairs, colourful but dim lights, and wall paintings. Joshua slipped his hand into hers as a waitress showed them to their table. He waited until she sat before sitting beside her, opposite her dad. The waitress poured water into their glasses and said she'd return soon to take their orders. After perusing the menus and placing their order, her father wanted to hear everything about the goings-on at Goddard Downs. There was a bit of melancholy in his tone, but he assured them he was quite happy in his new profession.
"And far less stressed, I might add. One of the perks of being an employee is that I don't have the weight of responsibility on my shoulders. When the day's done, so am I. No more late nights dissecting financials and worrying about bills."
"It must be a relief," Joshua said. Stella enjoyed seeing her parents and Joshua getting along so well. It gave her hope that once they broke the news, all would be well.
"Your brother was running things at Goddard Downs before he passed, wasn't he? I was sorry to hear about his death. He had a good business head on him, so I recall."
Tensing, Stella watched Joshua's reaction in her periphery vision. The subject of Julian was still a sensitive one, and she wasn't sure how he'd take her father's questioning. She glanced at her mother, their gazes meeting across the table. Unspoken words passed between them, and Stella knew her mother was as concerned about the change of subject as she was. To Stella's relief, Joshua didn't falter, instead smiling politely. "Yes, he did. He was a great help to our father, and his ideas for changing our business model helped a lot when the ban came into place." Her father shuddered.
The ban."
"Let's not discuss that subject." Her mother placed her hand lightly on his wrist. "I'm sure there are more pleasant matters to talk about." Smiling at Stella, she angled her head. "Is there a reason for this visit?" Stella gulped. The time had come. But right then, the waitress arrived with their dishes. Vegetable biryani and curried tofu for her, while her parents and Joshua were sharing 3 dishes, lamb rogan josh, chicken tikka masala, and a beef madras. "So," her mother continued as she spooned some curry on top of her rice, You were home only recently, Stella, and now you're back again. There has to be a reason. I agree, her father added, lifting his brow. Joshua squeezed Stella's hand. She looked at him and grinned, although her heart thumped. Well, there is something. I knew it, her mother exclaimed, her hand flying to her husband's shoulder. I told you, Jim. Her father's eyes widened as his gaze darted between Stella and her mother. Stell? Joshua squeezed her hand again before she could speak and leaned forward. Mr. Martin, Jim. You don't know me well, but I assure you that my intentions towards your daughter are sincere. I love Stella very much, and I want to spend the rest of my life with her. I asked her to marry me, and today we're here to get your blessing. From both of you, of course. Stella's gaze was riveted on her parents as Joshua announced their engagement. Their approval meant a great deal, and having it would be like a kiss from heaven. She was sure her mother would approve, but her father was a tough man to please. If he said yes, then she had no doubt she and Joshua would have their full support going forward. But would he? Her father studied Joshua coolly. Young man, it isn't every day someone asks for my daughter's hand. I'm honestly surprised to hear you say you want my approval. Most young folks these days simply tell their parents they're getting married, no matter what they think. So you've made a good start in my books. Stella released her breath. Now, regarding marrying our Stella, I'm sure you know she's our only child, and giving her to you or any man isn't something we'd take lightly. Her father met her gaze. We've been through a lot in this family, but we've stayed together. We've supported each other. Dad! She pleaded with her eyes for him not to go off on some wild tangent and to end her anxiety and just say yes or no. I can't wait to watch you walk down the aisle. Her father's words sent a wave of euphoria through her. Her mother started to laugh and cry at the same time. Joshua reached across the table to shake her father's hand. Her father's eyes glistened as he took it and offered his congratulations. That was it. It was now real. They were officially engaged. When Stella's parents suggested they go to the rodeo on Saturday afternoon, Joshua's pulse beat erratically. Neither he nor Stella had known it was on until they arrived in town, and he'd secretly hoped her parents wouldn't be interested in going. It wasn't that he didn't trust himself. It was simply that going would drag up too many bad memories. But his hopes were dashed. Her parents were keen to go. After spending Saturday morning eating a leisurely breakfast on the back deck, chatting and laughing and getting to know each other, Stella's parents took them on a tour of the town and the area before heading to the rodeo. After parking, they joined the line to get inside the showground. People must have come from far and wide because it seemed there were more lined up than lived in the small town. But the rodeo only came to town once a year, and Joshua knew how much of a drawcard it was. He just wasn't used to being on this side of the fence. Stella squeezed his hand as the commentator's voice blared through the speakers. She knew how anxious he was, but he was determined to simply enjoy being a spectator. All was well until he saw Sean's name on the program. Sean was here. Joshua hadn't seen his cousin since before Julian died. And last he'd heard, he wasn't doing too well. But he must have gotten himself together a little to be on the circuit. You couldn't be drunk or stoned when you were riding a bull. But if you were Sean, maybe you could. He closed his eyes and tried to push down the dread building inside him. Sean wouldn't be happy that he and Stella were engaged. He'd grown jealous of their friendship before they fled Goddard Downs. But that didn't matter. Joshua was following his heart, and if Sean had a problem with that, so be it. He wasn't riding until mid-afternoon. There was time to find him before then. But did he really want to see his cousin? But how could he not? Sean had no idea he was in town, but how could Joshua not seek him out? He leaned closer to Stella and pointed to Sean's name on the program. Her eyes widened. Sean's here. He nodded. I need to find him. I'll come with you. He was about to tell her it'd be better if she didn't, but she stood and grabbed his hand. Her parents looked up, quizzical expressions on their faces. "We won't be long," Stella said. "Can we get you anything?" "A beer each would be great," her father said. "Sure, no problem." She smiled and followed Joshua out of the stand. When they reached the ground, she turned to him. "Are you okay, Josh?" He inhaled slowly and gazed into her eyes. "Not really." "It'll be okay. Nothing happens that God hasn't ordained. He's growing you through this." That Stella could bring God into a situation like this amazed him. But maybe she was right. He was still learning God's ways. Maybe it wasn't a coincidence the rodeo was on this weekend and that Sean was here. His heart still beat in his throat, but he had a sense he wasn't alone. He gave a small smile. "I'm sure you're right." She leaned up and kissed his cheek. "Let's go and find him." He nodded and looked around. Where would Sean be? Then he spotted him through the crowd. Sean was leaning on the rail, beer in hand, laughing with someone. He turned his head and their gazes met. He lifted his hand, but visibly stiffened as his gaze shifted to Stella. Joshua started towards him, but Sean dropped his hand and walked in the other direction. A deep sadness filled Joshua. Was there so much bad blood between them that Sean wouldn't even say hello? Did he resent his friendship with Stella that much? She slipped her arm around his waist and pressed close, understanding how he was feeling. He didn't need to say anything. "Come on, let's get those beers for Mum and Dad." He nodded. He could have done with one himself, but he wouldn't go down that path. There were better ways to handle disappointment. He'd learned that the hard way, and he wasn't going back. The day passed. Sean went AWOL and Joshua didn't see him again, but his cousin was never far from his thoughts and prayers. He could have gone after him, but he knew in his heart it would be pointless. Sean's heart was hard and bitter, and he was lost. Joshua prayed that one day soon that would change. Stella wanted to say more, but she couldn't. Joshua said he was okay and put on a brave show, but she knew him better than that. She could see the hurt and pain in his eyes when Sean walked away. She rubbed his arm and prayed silently. "Lord, I've asked a lot of you lately, but if you could work in Sean's heart and let him accept our marriage, I'd truly appreciate it. Joshua loves his cousin, and I know how much it grieves him to see him like this. Lord, if it's your will, bring Sean back to Joshua and to Goddard Downs. Transform him, Lord, from the inside out. In Jesus' precious name, I pray. Amen." She squeezed Joshua's hand and leaned close as they walked to the bar to grab the drinks for her parents. The trip was successful, although a lingering hollowness hovered in Joshua's chest, and he knew why. Sean. He couldn't get his cousin out of his head. Seeing him at the rodeo and having him walk away grieved him to the core. But there was nothing he could do other than pray for him. As the plane began its descent into Kununurra, he stared out the window as his mother's voice echoed somewhere in his memory. "Be anxious for nothing, but by prayer and supplication with thanksgiving make your requests known unto God." Praying was the only thing he could do for Sean. His cousin wouldn't listen to him, but he might listen to God. "Lord, help Sean let go of his anger and jealousy. Let him see that there's more to life than partying and drinking. He's never had anything good to say about you, but you can change his heart. You can shatter that cold bitterness that envelops him. Help him see that he's not a failure or a waste of space, as others have said about him. Show him that he can have a life filled with hope and purpose. Let him be okay with my relationship with Stella. That we can still be close if only he lets go of his jealousy. I guess I'm asking you to bring him to where I am now. Instead of me following him, let him follow me this time. Let him follow me into your arms of grace. In Jesus' name, I pray. Amen." Beside him, Stella opened her eyes, stretched, and peered out the window. "Oh, we're almost there." Yes, he replied. She'd been asleep, leaning against his shoulder almost the entire flight. He took her left hand and lifted it to his lips, meeting her gaze above the ring that once again adorned her finger. I love you, Stella. Thank you for believing in me. Are you still thinking about Sean? He nodded. If only he could meet someone like you who believed in him. Or God. Not or. And. You're right. Only God can heal his bitterness and give him a new heart. Just like he did me. Amen to that. She leaned on his shoulder again as the plane approached the runway. Before they knew it, they'd be back at Goddard Downs planning their wedding. Chapter 20. Night crept in, and with it, foreboding, as Janella heard the news. Joshua and Stella were planning an early spring wedding. The date had been set, and it seemed that everyone, including Stella's family, was on board with their impending nuptials. Janella couldn't breathe as Serena shared the news she'd heard from Maggie just that afternoon. Why hadn't Maggie told her? She was aware of her apprehension about their engagement. Why let her hear second or third hand? Was everyone other than Serena trying to protect her? But something like this couldn't remain hidden for long. At least Serena had the decency to tell her. Despite Frank's belief that Joshua and Stella knew their minds, Janella would never forgive herself if she didn't convey her concerns to her brother-in-law, especially if their marriage fell in a heap. She'd talk to him now. Excusing herself from Serena, she removed her apron and marched to the barn. Joshua was inside, winding a length of rope around his arm. Joshua, can I speak with you a moment? He looked up, blinking. Sure, Janella. What's up? A lump formed in her throat. Her pulse thudded loudly against her temples as the words fell from her lips. I don't think you should get married. It's too soon. You haven't known Stella long enough, and I think you're doing it for the wrong reasons. I think you should reconsider. It was like an avalanche once the words started flowing, but with every word, a weight lifted off her chest. She'd kept her feelings tucked away inside for so long she hadn't realised how much they pressed upon her. He remained unperturbed, as if what she said hadn't surprised him. His response confirmed it. I've been waiting for you to say something. You have? Of course. I knew you weren't keen about our engagement. I know you too well, Janella. He set the rope aside and lowered himself onto a bale of hay, patting the space beside him. She reluctantly joined him. I know you mean well, but I know what I'm doing, he said. No, you don't, Janella snapped, rising to her feet as her voice pitched. You have no idea. You don't know what it is to make a lifetime commitment to anything. How can you possibly think you're ready to make that commitment to another person? Marriage takes hard work and compromise, and you don't know the meaning of either. You're always trying to rebel and do your own thing, but you can't when you have a wife and a family. You have to be stable, dependable, trustworthy. You have to do what's right for them no matter what. You have to put them first. She expected him to be angry, to raise his voice in turn, but he didn't. Instead, he looked calmly into her eyes and said, like Julian. Her vision blurred at the mention of her husband. Yes. For all his faults, your brother knew what it was to take responsibility. He did it every day of his life. He proved himself every day to be a man of integrity, willing to do whatever it took to care for his family. A tear rolled down her cheek. She quickly brushed it away. When he committed to something, he never wavered. Joshua stood and rubbed her arm gently. Like when he committed to you. You were what, 16 when he first told you that he loved you? He never once went back on that. She nodded and was unable to speak as more tears blurred her eyes and rolled down her cheeks. Soon they were falling freely. Joshua pulled her into his arms. I'm not Julian, and I don't want to be. I might not have done things his way, but believe me, I love Stella just as much as Julian loved you. and I'll do everything for her that he did for you and the children." Tears racked her body as Joshua held her close.
"You're doing this because of what happened," she said through her sobs. "You're doing this for the wrong reasons. You don't get married because your brother died. You don't make rash decisions in the midst of grief."
Anguish spilled over into her voice, but she was helpless to stop it. "I'm not," Joshua said softly. "I'm marrying Stella because I love her. From the moment I met her at Alice Springs, I couldn't get her out of my mind. I thought of her every day, and the second I saw her again, it was as if I'd lost my breath and gained it at the same time. Surely you understand that. I'm sure it's what Julian felt when he returned from Darwin and saw you again." She was speechless, her tears flowing too much for her to utter a word. But she remembered that homecoming, the look on Julian's face and the kiss he'd given her. It was a kiss that stole her breath and erased all the time apart. Could Joshua truly feel that way for Stella? "I know this upsets you, and if there was another way to do it so you wouldn't be upset, I would. But there isn't. We want our families to celebrate our happiness with us. Stella wants it too. She's been so worried about you. She wondered about the timing and what everyone would think, but we have to do what's right for us." The words were so similar to what she and Julian said to one another when they decided to marry. They knew some would oppose their engagement. They were young and from different backgrounds, but they were determined and proved everyone wrong. He lifted her chin with his finger. "I'm not who I used to be, Janella. I have to go forward. And so do you." She closed her eyes and sucked in a deep breath, her bottom lip quivering.
"I don't know how to. Everything stopped when Julian died."
"I know it feels that way, but it didn't. In time, you'll be able to put one foot in front of the other and keep going, but right now, you're still mourning, and that's fine. Mourn. But don't spend the rest of your life stuck there. No one wants that for you. Julian wouldn't want that for you. He loved you too much."
"It hurts."
Her throat was thick. Pain squeezed her heart. "I know it does. We all hurt, Janella. I miss Julian too. I have more regrets about his death than anyone on this station, but I know what my brother would tell me. He'd tell me to keep moving, not to linger in one place, but to do something to help others, to make a difference. He always aimed to do what was best for everyone, even when it meant overriding their wills. He always had the best intentions, even if he went about it in the wrong way." Drawing a slow breath, she nodded slowly. "That's true. You're a diamond, Janella. Julian knew it. I know it. You were made to shine, and you need to. When you shine, you make everything and everyone around you better."
"I don't know anymore, Joshua. I don't know how to be the old Janella. I don't know how to act as if my husband isn't dead. I know it's wrong, and that God loves me. But I feel so alone."
Sobs threatened to overtake her again.
"I don't know why, but I do. I feel more alone than I ever have in my life. It's unbearable."
"You aren't alone. We're all here for you. I'm here for you. I won't abandon you or this family again. You have my word on that. I'm committed to the life I've chosen, to Stella, to Goddard Downs, and this family. I won't run anymore. This is where I want to be, and you all are the people I want in my life. I spent so many years trying to escape what I needed most. Not anymore." His words gave her comfort, though they didn't eliminate her sorrow and pain.
"I miss Julian so much, and I'm scared Caleb won't come back. What if he falls in love with Darwin and doesn't want to come home when he's finished school? I saw the place. It was amazing. It was so much better than I ever imagined. How could he not love it?"
Julian loved it too, but he came back. To you. Caleb will come back as well. That boy is more like his father than any of us. And if there's anyone who'll see Goddard Downs into the next generation, it will be Caleb. Mark my words. You and Julian raised a good boy. I'm so proud of him. She stepped back and wiped her face with her hand, though her cheeks remained damp even after several passes. You should be. He's quite a young man, and we're all proud of who he's becoming. I don't have children yet, but one day I hope to do as good a job as you and Julian did with yours. Having this family around helped, and I know they'll help me and Stella when we get to that point. But for now, we'll be happy simply to have you supporting us in our marriage. Joshua looked at her keenly. Can you do that, Janella? Can you put your fears aside and be there for me? I need you to do that. Janella closed her eyes and inhaled slowly. How many people were worried when she and Julian married? But despite their worry, they were proved wrong. Maybe she was worrying needlessly. She opened her eyes, her voice barely a whisper. Okay. His expression brightened. Do you mean it? Yes. If you mean what you've told me, then it would be selfish of me to keep opposing you. I do want you to be happy. I know that, Janella, as I wish for you. She released a heavy sigh. We should get back. The others will be looking for us. She was spent and needed to rest. The day had been long, and this burst of emotion had sapped the last of her energy. Not yet. There's one more thing I want to do. What's that? Can I give you another hug? She let out a small chuckle. All right, if you have to. As he wrapped his strong arms around her, she let herself pretend it was Julian's chest her head rested on, not Joshua's. But only for a moment. Julian was gone. She knew that. But she was surrounded by family who loved her, and for that she was eternally grateful. Lord, thank you for being with me, and thank you for my family. Bless Joshua and Stella as they prepare to marry. Forgive me for my resentment and negativity. Help me to move forward. Somewhere in the depths of her being, a spark of hope ignited. She would get through this. She would be happy again one day soon. They strolled back to the house together as darkness engulfed the sky. Janella glanced at the man beside her. He'd changed. She could see that now. He wasn't the rash, undisciplined man he used to be. Julian would have been so proud of his little brother. Joshua? Yeah. I'm happy for you and Stella, I mean that. And I'll do whatever you need me to do in order to make your wedding a success. He faced her and smiled. I'm so happy to hear that.
Slow Dance at Dusk continues in Volume 3, Chapters 21 to 28. Click the link below to keep listening.